Hi, Kua. Is it working now?
I'm sending him, I'm sending him the link because he's not with UCI.
Yeah.
For some reason, it's not letting me add him as a co-host.
Uh-huh.
So
I,
I'm sending him an email right now to ask him if he can just join it.
okay. I have his number, so I can also text him.
Okay.
Um, so good afternoon. I'm delighted to see you all and am grateful that you have joined us. I want first to make a land acknowledgement to begin our event. UCI is located on the homelands of the Akamen and Tongva peoples who, in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to claim their place and act as stewards of their ancestral lands. I also want to share that this event is being recorded and may be made available on the Center for Medical Humanities website in the near future. My name is Jim Lee, and I'm the center's director. I want to thank the deans of the schools of medicine, humanities, and the Claire Trevor School of the Arts for their support of the center, as well as members of the community whose support has been so critical and uplifting. I also want to thank the center staff for their excellent work in making today's and all of our events possible. Ekua Arhin and Amanda Swain. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before I turn this over to Art Frank, I want to invite you to join us for our next event. On Thursday, October 27th at 12 p.m. over Zoom, we will hold our first Works in Progress presentation featuring Gwendolyn Pear from the Spanish and Portuguese department, who will share her work titled Derek Walcott Omeros, The Wound of Slavery in Crafting Resistance. We'll be sharing the registration link to this event shortly, so I invite you to join our mailing list so that you can be made of this and other CMH events. And I just put the link into the chat. Now let me turn to this event by introducing our featured speaker. I am so pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Arthur Frank, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Calgary. Since retirement, he has taught at VID Specialized University in Oslo, and most recently in the program in narrative medicine at Columbia University. His books include At the Will of the Body, The Wounded Storyteller, and in November 2022, King Lear, Shakespeare's Dark Consolations. His honors include being an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a winner of the Society's Medal in Bioethics, and the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Canadian Bioethics Society. I first read The Wounded Storyteller in the summer of 2009 when I was walking into patient rooms of an oncology unit at a hospital in downtown Los Angeles. It was a crucible of experience, and Art's book profoundly shaped the way I interacted with people on the floor, and in turn shaped how I engaged people outside the hospital. I cannot overstate how much of an influence his writing and thinking has made on mine. And for this, I am deeply, deeply grateful. And I imagine many of you joining us this evening resonate with my sentiment. What an intellectual treat to have you today. And with that, I yield the floor to Art Frank.
Thank you so much, Jim. Really appreciate that. I'm sorry not to be able to be there with you physically at Irvine and have the interactions that go with actually being there, but everything has two sides. And I'm also very glad to see in the participants some people who are not at Irvine themselves and are able to be here because we are on Zoom. So you make some and you lose some, and that's the way it is on these things. So I do appreciate seeing the names of some old friends among the participants. I also want to just take a moment because today I was stunned and very saddened to hear the death of Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour was an enormous influence to me in my work on narrative. He's not usually associated with narrative, but a great deal of what he wrote in his science and technology studies I found to be directly applicable to narrative. And his death is just an enormous loss for all of us. And I couldn't begin without saying that the world will be just a little bit less without thinking there may be a next book from Bruno Latour. For me, in the work I do, there's always an immediate concern, and then there's an underlying inquiry. My immediate concern since the late 80s, has been with illness experience. And particularly, how can you help ill people? How can the work we do actually be of help to people? The underlying inquiry is into the entwining of experience, narration, and dialogue. The difficulty of each of these words lies in their interdependence. None of them can stand by itself without the other two. I understand the relation between experience, narration, and dialogue as being like a game of rock, paper, and scissors. But in this version of the game, experience, narration, and dialogue each have all three of the properties of rock, paper, and scissors. Each cracks or cuts open the other two, and each is able to enfold the other two. Acts of narration, which include storytelling, enfold what we know as experience, but experience cracks open narrations that invariably fail to contain it. Narrations happen, they take place in relations of dialogue, and engagement in dialogue makes experience available not only to other people, but to ourselves, especially as we hear ourselves telling the narrations that we call life stories. To explore how experience, narration, and dialogue each brings us back to the other two, I want to begin this evening by talking about the book that Jim so kindly mentioned, The Wounded Storyteller. And that will lead me to the work that I'm doing now, in which I realized that the figure of the wounded storyteller requires a complementary figure that I call the vulnerable reader. I'll finally conclude with a brief statement of what, through all this, I think I've learned about what we call narrative, how narratives do their work, and how stories matter to us in our lives. I wrote The Wounded Storyteller to take stock of, and I hope to honor, the relationships with ill people that saturated my life in the early 1990s, following my own period of critical illness. Those relationships were not, I would emphasize, research. They were how I myself survived a period of extreme fragility. They were relationships that sustained me. To some of the ill people I knew, I was their grateful reader. I took refuge in the stories of people like Audre Lorde and Reynolds Price. To others, I was, in a journal series that I was editing at that point, their editor. I was helping people I met to tell their story in a prose published version. And to still others, I was an invited speaker in support groups and sometimes a member and peer counselor in those groups. None of these relationships could possibly stay in any discrete compartment separated from the others. The academic pretense that the activity of doing research has boundaries made no sense to me back then, nor does it now. Either on one account, I'm always doing research throughout my life, or according to some people who hew to strict canonical versions of methodology, maybe I've never done what they would consider proper research. That, I think, is what it is to work on narrative while living lives that we are perpetually narrating, and while we're receiving and responding to the narrations of others. It doesn't sit still. And I'll get back to that point. What I would call either the commitment or the discipline of The Wounded Storyteller as a book was to write about stories of illness outside the purview of the medical gaze. And some of you are too young to remember what it was like in the 1990s, but it was still a time when it was unusual and even radical for academic or professional writing to give unqualified privilege to the usually disprivileged voices of those whom medicine calls patients. That way of writing responded, I hoped, to the problem that ill people have of how to narrate experiences that don't fit the parameters imposed by institutional healthcare's vocabulary, by the plots that are preferred by healthcare workers, and by medicine's sense of relevance about what it is that's worth telling, especially the imperative desire of institutional medicine for an ending that justifies the means to that end. How, I asked, could ill people tell stories they can call their own? This might be called a question of narrative authenticity, although I will now proceed to deconstruct that ideal. As I ask this question of how people can tell stories worth calling their own, the part of me that's a sociologist realized the impossibility of that project. Bluntly put, we humans never tell stories that are uniquely our own. My preferred description is that humans are narrative bricoleurs, and there I adapt the figure proposed by the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss back in the 1960s. We are always gathering bits and pieces of other narrations and repurposing them to make up stories that we call our own. The forms of these stories, their plot structures, their character types, their tropes, their metaphors, these render the stories like rented suits of clothes in which we appear on some occasion and then take back to the shop for someone else to wear. The stories in which we represent our experiences are never our own in more than a provisional sense. And that's not a problem for us. But I think it does require our recognition, lest we misunderstand what we know as our experience, because experience is continually being cast into narrative form and then remembered and retold as stories in those narrative forms. The Wounded Storyteller proceeds in 3 parts, and I regret, but was never surprised, that the first and third parts got far less discussion than the middle part. In the first part, I argue that bodies, by getting sick, do more than provide the occasion and the topic of illness stories. Individual sedimentations of embodiment predispose what kind of story the storyteller tells. Illness stories are not only about bodies. First-person stories of illness are emanations of the bodies that tell them. As to what it means for a story to be of the body, I'll fall back on a great phrase from Audre Lorde's The Cancer Journals. Lorde wrote that she had to write about cancer, quote, in order to keep me available to myself. In order to keep me available to myself. She was struggling to find a new way of living in her post-mastectomy body. Surgical mutilation, what she called her new landscape, required she find new terms of self-knowing. But self-knowing cannot be centered in or on the self alone. It cannot reify the self as being in any way self-sufficient. Lourdes understands that remaining available to herself depends on making herself available to others. Her book is, maybe most of all, a plea for mutual recognition among those who share the plight of illness. And again, she's writing in the late 70s. This mutual recognition was anything but available. Lourdes knows that bodies are always in some form of dialogue with other bodies, each knowing itself only in relation to others. And that's a kind of primitive definition of dialogue. Each knows itself only in relation to others. These dialogical relations are mediated by forms of narration. We narrate ourselves through narrations to others. And in those narrations, experience becomes, in Lourdes' word, available to us. The middle chapters of The Wounded Storyteller present three types of narrative that are available to ill people at a cultural moment. And here I'll say something that some of you may want to disagree with later. I would welcome disagreement, but I don't see those forms of narrative as having changed much since the mid-90s. New media of telling unquestionably have developed. The internet has proliferated illness stories. But I don't observe much change in the core narrative structures of the stories that are told in these new media. If anything, my observation is that stories told on electronic media seem to require readers more immediate recognition of what type of story is being told and whether that story fits their expectations. And they don't respond real well when the story doesn't fit their expectations. That's a wrinkle of these new media. Now, when we utilize types, as in my three types of narrative, these types certainly constrain what we're able to perceive. The problem with types is that once we get them in our head, we put everything into them. That really is a problem, but it's also their utility. The value of types is that they make visible the patterns that run through our lives. The wrinkle with types is that we humans have a tendency to treat our creations as if they have their own reality. This is beginning to get too abstract and it needs an example. One of my favorite examples is that offered by the physician and writer Abraham Verghese in an article in 2008, in which he described the professional creation of the type known, or he calls, eye patient. Eye patient is what Verghese calls the representations of sick people that institutional medicine causes to appear on computer screens. These representations reduce the individual person to mostly numerical data, test results and such. And they stream that individual person into a line of treatment. Institutional medicine needs to create eye patients. Doing so simplifies the workflow and the accountability. Verghese is not arguing against such representations, nor do I repudiate the types in The Wounded Storyteller. Types make possible a reduced, tightly focused perception of people, and that has its uses. But then the type perpetuates that reduction as being the reality. People start thinking there's nothing more to eye patient than what's on the screen. We, whether we are social scientists or clinicians, or the we of everyday life, employing types to negotiate the overwhelming particularity of those lives, We readily forget that the types we employ are our creation. In Karl Marx's interesting usage, they are our fetish. Then we become confused and even upset when individual people refuse to act like the kind of puppet we categorize them to be. The biggest problem, and it's a problem because it cuts off dialogue, is the imagination that types are all that needs to be said, that invoking them somehow explains something or justifies some course of action. As in, okay, we've put that in a box, that ends it. It's the beginning, not the end. These reservations about types and topologies mean that for me, the third part of the wounded storyteller had to be an antidote. It had to offset the second part. The argument needed to move to those qualities of testimony that elude typification, precisely what stands outside of the types. After putting stories into these three boxes of narrative types, I had to take them out again. That involves asking a question I would now phrase using a word from Mikhail Bakhtin, the great theorist of dialogue. How are we who hear testimonial stories answerable to those stories? How are we who hear testimonial stories? And they can be any kind of suffering involved in that. How are we answerable to them? To hear someone's story is always to be answerable in our response, though the stakes may be low or high. The great dialogical tradition, the tradition of George Herbert Mead, of Martin Buber, of Levinas, of Bakhtin, reminds us that the self comes to be. It is made and kept available to itself through dialogical engagement with others. Storytellers must hear themselves, and they must hear themselves being heard. That, I think, is the core of what we call narrative medicine. People have to hear themselves, and they have to hear themselves being heard. A story is composed and told, each of these theorists says, in his own way, in anticipation of a response. And in the real time of storytelling, any story is already changing as those actual responses are being perceived. In the moment of a story being told, it is neither more nor less than a story on trial, a story that is awaiting responses that will reshape it. Just as no story is ever anyone's own, no story ever remains stable. A crucial problem of what's called narrative analysis, especially when such analysis rests on interview methods, is to keep that quality of flux in the foreground of everyone's attention. And I hope we get back to this, but if you ask me, how do you do it? My answer is, that's why it's writing. That's why writing is not just reporting on findings, it's an art form. The wounded storyteller sought to find what was best in the stories that I heard and read people already telling, and to ask what those stories want as their answerability. A different approach is to ask what wounded storytellers might tell. What do storytellers need if they, and I emphasize that they are sooner or later, almost all of us, if they or we are to tell stories that can do a better job of making our experiences available to us and to the others who witness our testimony. Stories that can do a better job of making us available to ourselves and to others. My type or figure that expresses a response to this need is the vulnerable reader. My recent work is most easily summarized by saying that every wounded storyteller can tell better stories by becoming a vulnerable reader. That troublesome qualifying adjective, better, is for me another dialogical word. That is, what counts as better is something that speakers have to keep working out among themselves in their local and contingent circumstances. I'm doubtful of attempts to theorize any universalistic standard of what's better. Those attempts risk tipping into monological assertion, which both scholastic and everyday thinking always hovers on the edge of monologue as opposed to dialogue. Rejecting monologue is not, however, a surrender to relativism, and that's the big problem that throughout my career, academic life has struggled with. How do we recognize pluralities of interpretation without the relativism of a post-truth society, as it's called, which we definitely want to avoid? We humans can engage in dialogues in which we reshape each other's stories in search of what we recognize as better, without needing to specify a finalized standard, much less impose standards on others. In that continuing process, it's important to accept that we will often be wrong. But then, and here the dialogical narrative stance becomes bottomless, when we're wrong, we can tell ourselves stories about that. And we can use those stories as a foundation from which to move on. The vulnerable reader is someone who hears stories, whether these are works of literature or everyday talk, through the lens of their own troubles, both immediate troubles and anticipated troubles. Vulnerable readers are moderately self-conscious of being bricoleurs. They know they're picking things up without a clear idea of their future need. And they're allowing what's picked up to refine their sense of what might be useful. The sense of purpose in vulnerable reading is thus recursive. Purpose is always being reshaped by changing needs and the usefulness of what has been collected to respond to those needs. But these abstractions are less useful than my introducing you to a particular vulnerable reader. My model of a vulnerable reader, my patron saint, is someone described by my friend Philip Davis in his book, Reading for Life. For a number of years now, Philip Davis and Jane Davis have organized, and Philip has studied, small groups of people who come together to read novels, short stories, and poems. This project is called The Reader, and you can Google it and you can find short video clips of some of these groups, so you can see what they're doing. It's fascinating. These groups meet in community centers, sometimes in medical offices, occasionally in mental hospitals. Participants come from multiple social locations, and they often defy stereotypes of what someone with that education would be reading. One such reader is given the pseudonym of Georgina, who has had what Philip Davis tactfully suggests is a disadvantaged life, a pretty rough life. She offers us a wonderful evocation of vulnerable reading when she describes an occasion of having a medical appointment. While she waits to be seen, she reads Joseph Conrad. And she describes this to Phil. When I took Lord Jim into the hospital, In the waiting room, I got it out with a sort of, okay, come on, show me something then. And I can't do the North of England accent, but I can hear her saying that. It's a challenge to the book. She's really making a demand. It's great. For purposes this evening, we really can stop right there before Georgina gets into describing what the novel Lord Jim does show her. All we need is Georgina's description of herself asking of the story, show me something then. That challenge, situated in a hospital waiting room, which is my typical scene of anxiety, is vulnerable reading. That's what vulnerable reading is. It's somebody in a situation of anxiety picking up a story and saying, what have you got to show me? The ambitions of vulnerable reading are modest. Lord Jim won't solve anything for Georgina. Instead, the story might offer her a different way of living with problems neither she nor anyone else can solve. And that's always been the territory that I've tried to work on, the problems that no one can solve, but someone has to live with. Engaging Georgina in vulnerable reading is a complementary approach to the standard social science health research practice of asking her to tell her own story. And vulnerable reading has its advantages. Philip Davis does not interview Georgina about her life. He emphasizes that he has a conversation with her in which they discuss reading that both of them are doing as fellow readers. His stance to her is as a fellow reader. We could, and again, maybe should stop right there, but let's imagine that Georgina in the future does choose to tell a version of her own life story. What would that story be? On my account of how experience and narration go together, any life story is the result of bricolage, when the stuff that's been picked up is repurposed and put to use. What proves useful and how it proves useful is most often a surprise. Certainly for me, and I think for Davis, Georgina reads without any specific expectations. That's where this differs from what's sometimes called bibliotherapy. Georgina never expects to know in advance how her reading will affect her. All that's certain, at least to me, is that without what has been gathered, nothing could later be put together. Without the bricolage of gathering, the eventual putting together of the story couldn't be. In the moment of the hospital waiting room, Georgina picks up Conrad, and he does show her something. But he does more than tell her a story. Conrad extends Georgina's own capacity for her storytelling. The key point of vulnerable reading is to help people expand their capacities as storytellers. That's what truly counts. My turn to vulnerable reading thus responds to a problem that I increasingly had with first-person storytelling about illness, as this continued after The Wounded Storyteller was written through the late 90s into the 2000s. What seemed in the early 90s to be ill people's need to tell stories of their experiences in their own voices is now too often experienced as a demand to tell. In one of the most admirable recent illness narratives, Anne Boyer, in a book called The Undying, writes, at least in an age of awareness, and she puts awareness in scare quotes, what we are told must be given up for the common good is not so much one's own life as one's life story. The silence around breast cancer that Audre Lorde once wrote into is now the din of breast cancer's extraordinary production of language. In the demand to tell that Boyer experiences, words are given up, as she puts it. People feel called upon to fit their experience to expected narratives with their rhetorical conventions. Instead of that, vulnerable reading merely puts people in the company of stories, mostly stories that do not concern illness, which is another difference from bibliotherapy. And these stories offer refuge from the din that oppresses Boyer. Literary stories and poetry can offer resources for imagining alternative ways to tell, including new ways to imagine what needs telling. And that, I think, is really the crux of it. New ways to imagine what needs telling. That is why wounded storytellers need to be vulnerable readers. One way to study vulnerable reading would be to proceed as Davis does, having conversations with people like Georgina. In part because my recent work was done during pandemic lockdown, I proceed in the book that Jim mentioned, Shakespeare's Dark Consolations, that'll be out in North America at the end of November. I proceed by offering a demonstration of vulnerable reading with myself as the reader of King Lear. I read King Lear by asking Georgina's question, what have you got to show me? My point is to show one way of collecting fragments that may be of present or future consolation. In showing my readers what Shakespeare shows me, I'm authorizing them to read in ways that I think classroom versions of literary criticism have often discouraged, although I emphasize that that's changing. There's a new generation of critics out there practicing in very different ways. One specific authorization is for readers to do what has been hitherto forbidden in literature classes, which is to identify with characters. I suggest that characters can talk back to us. Thus, my reading grants literary characters existence outside the texts that brought them into existence. Next, I ask how the story in a literary work, the plot in a sense, might be adapted by readers to offer them a place that they've fashioned and can inhabit. To me, a criterion of what makes a speech act into a story is that a proper story can be retold in different words, and it can be reset in different times and places. Stories invite adaptation, as the multiple adaptations of Shakespeare's stories exemplify. For vulnerable reading, all literary storytelling is interactive, inviting readers to reset it in contexts that reflect their own lives. Or you could call it fan fiction. Not finally, but sufficiently for these remarks, vulnerable reading authorizes what Shakespeare's readers have always done, which is to take his language, to take his phrases, to take short quotations out of context and allow these words to reappear in diverse situations. As we quote Shakespeare, his words allow us to express what our words could not. I'm especially interested in the uncanny experience of speaking words that are simultaneously our own and not our own. Quoting Shakespeare, and sometimes even better, misquoting him, creates another layer of dialogue. Speaking his words as a response to our immediate needs in our context makes our speech permeable rather than territorial. I count that as a good thing. And it's just so appropriate that the presentation after this one is on Derek Walcott's adaptation of The Tempest. Thank you, Jim. That was just really, really outstanding programming. We appreciate that. That's what Shakespeare is for. He's to be recast. And Oneros is obviously based to a considerable degree on the Odyssey, but in the post-colonial themes, yeah. What I've said so far does not admit a conclusion in the sense of this is now the message. So in lieu of a conclusion, let me suggest to you 4 things that I've learned about stories and storytelling. Some of these follow from what I've been saying about wounded storytellers and vulnerable readers, and some may push those types in further directions. First, I've never felt comfortable with the idea of what's called the narrative self. I've tried to avoid using that term, although I probably have. I believe that what we call the self does comprise narrative fragments, along with images and sound bites, including Shakespearean quotations. But I don't believe that selves as they are being lived follow any cohesive narrative. That is, the sort of narrative that most autobiographies construct retrospectively. Thus, I'm always attracted by moments in the illness narratives when the author reflects on all that is left out and all that is made much more coherent in its retelling than it was experienced at the time. Or moments in memoirs that open up the gap between what happened and what gets told in the story about what happened. Vulnerable reading offers material, again, characters, plots, quotations, that people can use in their works of narrative reconstruction. That's what I think we're doing in our lives. We're doing works of narrative reconstruction, works that include filling in what once could not yet be told, those experiences that could not yet be told, but might be expressed if new resources are now made available. Second, I think I've learned that experience needs stories if it is to become what we can reflect upon and share. But as narrative unfolds experience, experiences cut their way back out of narrative form. Listening requires hearing the sound of that cutting. Or to switch to a visual metaphor, we need to see an aura of inexpressibility around any story. That's the problem with taking a transcript and coding it. You can't get the aura of inexpressibility that I think is often the most significant part of any story. What deserves to be called dialogue means hearing the other person's struggle to tell and sensing what remains beyond what that person can tell right now. Stories, crucially, never say it all. Third, and most controversially perhaps, I believe that stories have lives of their own. And as stories live their lives, they themselves are tricksters. Stories are most obviously shapeshifters, reappearing in different cultures as recognizably the same, yet dressed up differently. They are dangerous tricksters in their amorality, with which they variously create and destroy. I wrote a number of years ago an article called The Necessity and Danger of Stories at the End of Life. And that theme of pairing necessity and danger is much more prevalent in the recent writing about narrative. Stories as tricksters intrigue us humans. And being intrigued, we easily lose track of whether we should hear a story as a caution or as an inspiration. We should never let ourselves be too sure where a story is leading us. Finally, and going most against the academic grain, I wish we who study narrative would speak less about doing narrative analysis and give more attention to how we ourselves need to learn, and then how we can possibly model in our writing and teaching what I call narrative discernment. By that, I mean discerning which stories we should regard as cautions, stories that show us how not to behave, and which stories we take as inspirations. Most stories entwine the cautionary and the inspirational, because both of these aspects are, I think, in life, pretty much inseparable. Being bricoleurs requires discerning what we pick up, which stories we take into our lives, because those fragments will work their way into becoming stories we call our own. Narrative discernment may be most difficult when we push ourselves to engage stories we don't want to hear, stories that initially repel us. And those these days are not hard to find. Those stories are often the ones whose characters we need to hear talking back to us. Vulnerable reading, as I've tried to demonstrate its practice, is a pedagogy of narrative discernment. Learning discernment is, for me, not just a big deal. On my account, and here I'm becoming political, it's the big deal of our times. A problem with narrative and experience has been intensifying, I think, for nearly a century. Walter Benjamin, in his 1936 essay, The Storyteller, written as the Nazis consolidated state power, famously wrote that the art of storytelling is dying out. Encounters with people who know how to tell a story properly are becoming ever rarer. Today, I hear people mostly repeating slogans. Those slogans imply a story, but when these people are asked to express themselves in a more fully told story, they can only repeat the slogan as if it were a story. Stories are always, in one aspect, tokens of group membership. But some tokens that claim to pass as stories too readily assume shared experience instead of working, and I think it's some of the hardest work we do, to make experience available to ourselves and others. One task of narrative studies is to understand and then to defend what Benjamin meant when he wrote, as was his habit, far too cryptically, of telling a story properly. What's going on in that little word, properly? Even if there can never and should never be codified boundaries that prescribe a proper telling, to back away from discernment about what are proper stories would fail to help people as they struggle to become available to themselves, both individually and collectively. Thank you, and I really look forward to our discussion of these things. Turn it back to Jim to moderate.
Thank you, Art, for what an insightful presentation. We have maybe about 20 or 30 minutes for a conversation, a dialogue, as it were. And so you're invited to unmute yourself. and raise a question. If you can use the raise hand function, I can kind of see you and call on you. If you prefer to use chat, you also may do so, and I will read your chat question aloud so that the recording can capture your question. So, but the floor is open if anyone would like to ask a question or offer a comment.
I love the phrase unmute yourself. It's just great.
Go ahead, Matthew.
One, I just want to say thank you for the work that you've done. It's been important in my life as well. But to ask a more pointed question, when you talk about the ways in which we kind of put things in boxes and then take them out of boxes, and the value of kind of not, fitting everything into these kind of pre-scripted content boxes. And then you spoke later on in the humility kind of direction about the way that we need to be. I was taking it as be surprised by the ways in which our stories lead us, or but then you kind of got to the inexpressibility concept, and so I want to ask a question about that. I'm a big fan of Stanley Cavell, who does some work on Shakespeare that you might enjoy. But he uses Wittgenstein to talk about the way in which our words and world are lived together, and that they break apart at the same place. And so this is things that we can't live. Maybe in our society, I think of the experience of losing a child and not being able to live that experience, or profound experience of personal suffering and pain, that we might find those to have moments of inexpressibility, and silence and presence might be the only way to kind of address those. You address them as silence. I was wondering if you think there's a place for silence in this conversation, and what your thoughts are on how that would function in relationship to the value of narrative, which I'm on board with as well.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for mentioning Stanley Cavell, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think he's one of the most truly profound commentators on Shakespeare, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to figure out some of the things he says. Silence is very difficult, and academic life tends to militate against silence, because we trade in pages that we have to fill up, and lecture space that we have to fill with words, and so we tend to tip our hat in the direction of the need for silence, but it's much more difficult to speak about. I mean, in terms of Wittgenstein, it's like the gnomic last line of the Tractatus. It's one of those things about which we have to, silence is something about which we have to remain silent. I think for me, where silence becomes crucial is when we move to a practice like narrative medicine. When I talk to professional groups, physicians, nurses, other healthcare professionals, and they're asking how do they initiate a narrative-based practice. One of the things I recommend is that you start by having moments of noticeable silence. And the work I did decades ago on conversation analysis, for most of us, a 2 to 3 second pause is a notable silence. People notice that. And in medical settings where people tend to speak even faster, silences are very easily marked. And so I think as we move into the practice of narrative medicine, silence is a crucial way of beginning to do that. Trying to write about silence is a matter of again calling attention to it, but we run into this paradox that if it's expressible for the person, you have to be very careful about trying to express what they couldn't express, because you risk simply projecting your own feelings into their situation. And I think really it's a matter of marking this, and marking ways in which they seem to be reaching for something more, but possibly not there yet. And I think that can be done with the greatest respect. And that's really the crucial issue in writing about anyone's sharing of their experience, is to bring the greatest measure of respect to that. That in turn is why we don't want to seem to pretend that we can sum up that experience too neatly. There's a persistent thing in social science, goes back to ethnography, when people really did, long-term traditional ethnographies. And insofar as they did ethnographies of literate populations, and the literate population then read the ethnography, people generally were really annoyed, seriously, at what was written about them. People tend to object to the objectification of themselves on the social scientific page. One reason why healthcare settings don't like to make charts available is that patients tend to object to the way they're objectified in charts and the language of charting. That raises all sorts of issues that we could begin to get into tonight. But the point I do want to make is that I think in health research, we still have a long way to go in thinking seriously about what makes a report respectful to those who are being reported upon. And part of that to me is leaving. I'm working so hard in my own writing to leave some gaps in it. Not to try to write it up too tightly, which is how a lot of us were taught. So those are some roundabout thoughts to your somewhat roundabout question. But it's just something we will continue to try to do each in our own way and learn from each other.
Thanks, Art. I'd like to also invite, for those who do have questions, if you feel comfortable doing so, to turn on your camera. While I love to see the names, it would be also nice to see faces. So if you would like to do so when you're posing your question, again, either via the chat or by unmuting yourself. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your fantastic work and for talking to us this evening. You spoke about a story on trial and spoke about a story awaiting responses that will reshape it. And I identify with that both as a writer and a teacher of writers. I'm helping developing writers express their stories, and I want to help them do it with greater narrative competence, but without doing violence to their stories, without remaking their stories in my own image. How do you think about that?
That was the problem I confronted back in the 90s when I was editing this series called Case Stories for a bioethics journal in Chicago that no longer exists. And the perpetual tension was between my instincts, which were to accept the story in its raw form, because the rawness was part of the testimonial value of the story. That was what gave it part of its impact, versus the extremely competent managing editors who were trained manuscript editors and who wanted to make it neat, who wanted the parts to follow each other, who wanted to round off the more jagged edges, because that's a lot of what manuscript editing does. It encourages you to fill in gaps, as opposed to simply leaving the reader to think about why there had to be a gap there, because experience is actually gappy if we can we allow ourselves to notice that. That also becomes a problem in journal publication health research, which again aspires to tell the whole story and aspires to make its commentary on the story unassailable. There's so much in the journal thing. For you working with writers, I can't say more than it's just going to be, that'll be a constant struggle of one manuscript at a time and where each one is and what they're trying to do. And I don't think there are ever any generalized principles. I mean, I started off saying a word about Bruno Latour. One of the things I think Latour wrote about that means the most to me was when he took up the question of when do you know research is finished? When do you know you've collected enough data? And in responding to that question, he said, well, first of all, you don't want to separate the collection of data from the writing of the report. You're always writing the report. And basically, you've collected enough data when you're able to write a report that has not so much the sense of an ending in Frank Kermode's famous phrase as a sense of complete description, a sense of having described enough. And there's a kind of gestalt recognition that at that point, you just know it's all there. You know that nothing else would contribute that much, even though there always could be something else. Yeah. And I think that's when you study Shakespeare's plays seriously, as you probably have, what's fascinating is the gaps between, and they, as you're watching the play, you hardly notice them, and then when you go through the play, reading it reflectively, you say, "Whoa, how do we get from there to there? What happened in that interim?" For people who like graphic novels, the concept of the gutter has been deployed in really interesting ways around this, in that the eye moves between the frames of a graphic novel, skipping through the gutter, and we rarely notice everything that was happening in that gutter space between one image and dialogue and the next one. We just fill it in, and that can be perilous. You know, I mean, that's a dangerous human capacity, but that's the way I think we live our lives, and yeah, to go further really takes us into this phenomenology of reading as experience. So thank you for flagging that. None of us are ever going to answer it. We're just going to keep struggling with it. And I think, as in response to Matthew's question, the most useful thing I can do is just say, after working on this stuff, you know, what's become a long time now, I just validate that as a continual struggle that everybody will continue to work with.
That's great. Others?
So, thank you so much. I'm Bruce Campbell. I'm a retired head and neck cancer surgeon, and so I come at this from a clinical perspective, and as a wannabe writer. So the last few years of my practice, I spent a lot of time with my residents and students and patients, trying to discern where they were with their illness narratives based on your writing. And so now you've thrown me for a loop with this aura of that can sit around the stories and be.
Oh,
Sorry, I must have hit the mute button. So the aura of inexpressibility around stories is a concept I'm not familiar with, but I can imagine that it has a real impact in the healer patient relationship as people try and discern the best way to move toward healing. So as a clinician, how would we teach our students to recognize this aura, and how do we begin to probe it as a goal for achieving health?
That is really the big question that anybody who engages in medical education runs into. And my best answer is to just start practicing by taking a moment, which a lot of hospital-based residents really have a hard time doing. And by a moment, I literally mean spaces of 5, maybe 10 seconds of just stopping, just stopping right there and look at the person, just be with them in a silent way. If it's appropriate, put your hand on someone's arm, and in that space, let go so far as you can of your highly task-oriented purposes. And residents in particular are just so driven by their list of tasks that they have to get through. That's always between themselves and getting some sleep. Just let go of that for a minute and be in that situation. And if that sounds like some kind of meditative practice, well, it sort of is. It's where I think the best of chaplaincy practice has a great deal to teach clinical practitioners, because the best of chaplains work slowly, and their work involves a lot of spaces between, a lot of silences, in which they give people what I think everybody most wants, which is a sense of recognition, a recognition of the enormity of what this illness is imposing on your life. Too many hospital workers of all kinds tend to minimize that enormity. They tend to minimize the extraordinary burden that treatment is putting on people, in part because they're having trouble acknowledging the inadequacy of what they do. I'll put in a plug right now for Jay Baruch's recent book called Tornado of Life, Baruch. Jay is a emergency room physician at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. And Tornado of Life is published just by MIT. And he gets back over and over again to the gap between what he's able to offer in his institution and what he knows his patients need. And I think the beginning of healing for clinicians is to let themselves feel that gap and acknowledge it, as opposed to repressing it in various ways. So part of my answer to your question, Bruce, is I think physicians need to go a great distance in healing themselves, and recognizing, as Jay does so well, how they're constantly confronted with what they themselves can't do, which is also the burden of what their patients are having to live with. But at least you can not burden the patients with a denial of that, which is what I think the worst of healthcare often does. That because we don't acknowledge it, we require that you pretend you're not experiencing it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very good. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for, I think retired physicians have such an extraordinary role to play in medical education. And because, you can say things to young physicians that a non-physician like me just can't say.
Thanks. I'm living the dream. So thank you for what.
Great.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions if anyone has them. I actually have a question, but I'll hold off to make room for others. Okay, then I will assert directorial privilege. I'm really fascinated by this this dyadic kind of metaphorical relationship between the wounded storyteller and the vulnerable reader. And I'm wondering, to the extent that, it's a kind of a two-part question, Art, to the extent that the vulnerable reader brings their whole self to the experience of reading or hearing or listening, how does one bring that whole self without letting the narrative in their head getting in the way of actually hearing or reading the other's experience? And relatedly, how does power and authority kind of impact that reading, listening experience? Here I'm kind of thinking the experience of reading Conrad or Shakespeare, we know who they are. How would that reading experience be different if, for example, as I've kind of done in my own research on kind of Asian American memoir, to what extent does a kind of asymmetry of power or perceived asymmetry of power affect one's capacity to be that vulnerable reader? So like a white reader of an Asian American text. If you can take one or both of those elements.
Yeah. Let me actually address the second one first. That may be better. I think part of what's really great about the project called The Reader, Philip and Jane Davis's work, is that they present books outside of their canonical status. And that, of course, is the problem with teaching literature in a curriculum, is that just by virtue of it being in the curriculum, it achieves a kind of canonical status. The oxymoron of having a Norton anthology of non-canonical work, but once you've created it as a Norton anthology, it's now canonical. I go back to Georgina. Georgina really doesn't give a hoot who Joseph Conrad is. He actually doesn't, I think, have very much authority for her. She's not going, ooh, this is or this is Shakespeare. She's really saying, what have you got to show me? I don't care how many other people have read you. I don't care how many other editions there are in your work ever since you wrote it. What have you got to show me? It's bringing people into a very direct relationship of what will this do, for you, not who is this. And that doesn't mean that you need to thoroughly ignore the historical situation of the writer. That can be brought into the conversation, but it does mean that just because it's Dante or Milton or Conrad, that gives it any particular anything. It's a radical version of reader response theory. Shakespeare only has authority to the extent that I make him something in my life. And it's I who ceded that authority because his authority can help me. It's I who found something helpful in that. And I think the work that the reader's done, the work that I'm trying to do, are for each reader to say, not, oh, King Lear, great work of English literature, but what's this going to be to me, regardless of what it is. In a curious way, I find myself having some sympathy with movements to not teach Shakespeare in high schools, because as soon as you put it on the curriculum, you set it up on the pedestal that's, creates the problem that your question is getting at. I would actually tell high school students, whatever you do, you don't want to read Shakespeare. Much too radical, way too much sex and violence in it. You really shouldn't read it, you know. And people fall in love, and that's, you know, really, you don't want to read about that, especially as an adolescent. It's a very bad idea. So stay away from it. Absolutely. Getting back to the narratives in your head, I think that's where you need the kind of immersive reading. In the reader groups, they spend a lot of time reading aloud, and they will take one passage and go around the circle. These groups are usually like, I don't know, 6 to 8 people, maybe 10, and they'll all read a passage serially. And I think that as you do that, you just it becomes what it is for you, and that's how you're able to break through that. That having been said, we never get beyond the narratives we've got in our head. You know, narrative therapy, which I've studied a fair amount, is very much about becoming self-conscious of the narratives we've got in our head and how those predispose us to experience ourselves and our possibilities in certain ways. But I don't think we never entirely wake up from our own histories. You know, it's always there for us. And the notion of self-reflection, to me, always involves necessary limitations. One of my favorite sociologists is Pierre Bourdieu, and his notion of disposition. We're always working within a structure of inherited dispositions that go back to our childhoods. And we can reflect on those, and we can make some kinds of choices about them. But there's only so far we can ever get out of that, and that's just another perpetual tension of our lives. But the stories we read from a position of our own vulnerability, I think, can give us, dare I say, a certain courage to confront what we do carry, even if we're going to go on carrying it.
Thank you so much for that. I sense that we are coming to an end. I'm going to wait, what was it, 3 to 5 more seconds in case there is a question.
That's a notable pause, yes.
Notable pause. Well, with that, I want to thank Art once again for really such an insightful presentation. I continue to learn from you, and I'm so grateful that you spent time with us to share your wisdom with us. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of it, and I hope you have a great weekend. Be safe, be well, and be kind to others. Bye all.